God loves all that God loves. Think about that. Think about it.
And then the context of the whole thing then is like tend the garden, till the soil, take care of this, what I call the whole community of creation. Mm-hmm. And so that is who we are as people. If we are taking care of the whole community of creation, whether it be like we're taking care of the earth or water or trees, or whether it be we're like taking care of missing and murdered Indigenous women and trying to work on that, or getting good water to cities that need it, or whatever is out of balance, whatever is out of harmony, that's our job. That's our purpose as human beings.
Historically speaking, a way station is a rest stop for weary pilgrims at the end of their day of travel. It's a safe place to get a meal, to replenish supplies, and rest up before the next day's journey. It's an opportunity to enjoy the company of others, to get news from other lands, and to exchange ideas. Way Station's podcast allows me to share with you some of the people I meet on my many travels: authors, artists, theologians, activists, people that think differently than me, who have perspectives I wouldn't come to on my own, and who enrich my vision and appreciation for the complexities that make life the wonder and challenge that it is. Thanks for joining me. My name is Steve Bell, and this is Way Station's podcast. Hi, and welcome back to Way Station's podcast. Today is my absolute delight to introduce you to Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley. And there's a lot to be said about him, so just bear with me just for a minute. I first met Randy at a NATES symposium at Wheaton College over a decade ago. He is a Keetoowah Cherokee and is one of the co-founders of NATES, which stands for the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies. Randy is a recently retired professor of Indigenous and Intercultural Studies at George Fox Seminary in Portland, Oregon. He's also the author of many books. I've read his 2012 book, Shalom and the Community of Creation, an Indigenous Vision, 3 times. And in it, Randy convincingly parallels a Native American social harmony ethic, which he calls the Harmony Way, with the ancient Hebrew vision of Shalom. So it's a great book. Okay, this past year was a very busy publishing year for Randy, who released 3 books. Indigenous Theology and the Western Worldview, a decolonized approach to Christian doctrine. Mission and the Cultural Other, which is a critique of the modern colonial missions project from the perspective of its casualties. And Becoming Rooted, 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth, which is more of a daily devotional. I've read them all and highly recommend them to anyone thinking about post-colonial recovery of authentic Christian faith and witness. So Randy is also a musician and a songwriter. He's referred to as a wisdom keeper and an elder. He is a missional farmer. He and his wife Edith have recently established a nonprofit farm and education center called Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice, which focuses on developing, implementing, and teaching sustainable and regenerative earth practices. So links to the books and the center can be found in the show notes. So according to its website, the vision of Eloheh comes from a sacred dream and desire to help their own Indigenous people regain their spirituality, values, vision, and land. The vision has expanded naturally over the years to assist non-Indigenous people to develop a more Indigenous worldview. So we'll jump into the conversation where I ask Randy to unpack what he means by worldview. But before doing that, let me just mention that at the end of the conversation, I'm debuting a new cut of an older performance video of my song, Wouldn't You Love to Know? And so for those of you who are listening, you'll have to flip to YouTube if you want to watch that. Here's Randy. Randy, what do you mean, first, what does worldview mean? I sent you in my pre-notes, I come from Baptist stock, and Baptists don't have a worldview, we have the truth. And so I'm not used...
I'm an ordained Baptist minister. I don't know if you knew that.
Oh, no. Oh, you are. Okay. Yeah. We have that in common. So I didn't really grow up having any appreciation for anything like I would have a worldview that colors how I take in information, how I use it. Explain to me as best you can what worldview means and why that's important.
Yeah, so basically an anthropological discovery or way of expressing things in the world of anthropology. Worldview is deeper than culture. So like our culture are probably like the artifacts and the things that we, how we eat our meals and, what foods we eat and all that kind of stuff. But worldview is really more about it creates worldviews aren't taught, by the way, generally they're just caught.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more how we just see the world. It's how we value things. So we often think what we think is true for everybody, and we universalize that, and that's one of the pitfalls of the Western worldview. But it may not be true for other people. So, for example, in the world of Western European folk, being on time is a really important thing. It's like, if you respect the process and you respect us and respect, then be on time.
Right.
But in the indigenous world, that's not the worldview. That's not the value. The value is, if you're talking with somebody, that relationship is important in the right now. And so you don't just leave because you're supposed to be at a meeting. You finish doing everything that you have to do, and then you show up when you show up. And so we call that Indian time, right?
Right.
IT.
Yeah.
And and a lot of other cultures around the world have something so similar. Probably some of your folks who have visited the Philippines or Mexico, or they all have sort of their own way of expressing that value. But that's a difference in worldview. It's what the values that you place on things. And it ends up that indigenous worldview and a Western worldview are very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you give me a couple other examples just for folks too? What's another Western worldview that would be evidently different to an indigenous worldview?
Well, one of the things, and I have to speak as a American from the United States. I've been to most of the provinces in Canada, and I'm probably one of the few Americans who know all the provinces of Canada, but
all right.
but I don't really understand the worldview as much of Canadians, so I'd have to speak from my own experience. And so there are things like, for example, people in the United States are very competitive.
Okay.
Right. Very competitive. We're taught that in school. We're taught that in our jobs. We're taught to get on top and beat the other person. But in indigenous worldview, it's more cooperative. It's like, well, how can we help each other? Right.
Right.
Attain something, and so moving like the group forward instead of moving in an American way would be moving the individual forward. Right.
Right. You know what? This reminds me, when I was at that First Nates conference, there was a fellow there who gave a lecture. He was from Alaska. Does that ring a bell with you? He was a great speaker. Anyways, he was telling stories of the indigenous community. He came from there, and he says the stories that we tell our children are so different than other people's stories. So he said a lot of the stories that we tell are about a boy and grandmother, and they survive together, and then the boy grows up and wants to be independent. He sneaks off by himself, and that sets off a whole bunch of negative consequences. Eventually comes back. There's ceremony, and he's restored to communion with his grandmother, and harmony is restored. Right, and so the basic teaching is that you are a we, and that to stray from that is to do great harm. He says, and then the Western worldview, the settler teachers come in and tell kids, if you work hard, you can get ahead. Right, and
I remember him telling that story. It was an Orthodox priest.
Yeah,
and that story is. It's really kind of funny, it's because his grandmother tells him he gets tired of eating the same thing all the time, which is dried seal. And so he goes out, and his grandmother tells him not to wander far, but he does. He gets a fish, and then he thinks, oh, I can't take this back because there won't be enough, so I'll just eat it here. He doesn't share with the grandmother. Then he keeps going farther, and then he finds something else and then something bigger, and along the way he begins to grow in size. And at one point, he eats a whole whale, and he becomes this big monster. And when he returns to his grandmother's house, he can't get down the chimney because, or he can't get in the door. He's too big, and so she says, "You're going to have to come down the fireplace." And trust me. And so, basically what happens is that he comes down the fireplace and he gets to be a boy again. He's small. So there's a whole lot of lessons in that, right? But
Yeah.
as an American, what we would say is like when he becomes big, that's the end of the story, right? He made it, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Well,
those are very different values.
Well, he talked about being a kid, and you grow up with these sorts of stories, and then somebody tells you if you work hard, you can get ahead, or you can become big. And he says everything in your psyche would be saying, "You're Satan. You're you're teaching me the exact wrong." So I guess that would be a world view, how you approach a story or teaching like that.
Yeah, and so my argument is, number one, that the Western worldview will not sustain us in our future. It's a flawed worldview. It's really done the world no good. We are losing our grip in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of systems, and many of them are failing. But the biggest failure is how we've treated the earth and how the earth is responding back.
Yeah.
And so that worldview is not going to sustain our future. And so what we do is we say, well, what kind of worldview will sustain our future? Well, how about the one that has sustained indigenous people on this continent for, since time immemorial?
Mm-hmm.
Because what's happened over those many, many thousands of years is that people had learned to basically live with the earth, not just on the earth. And they have learned to live pretty much with each other. Not a utopian society, not perfect, mm-hmm. but to learn to appreciate things like diversity and cooperation and the kinds of values that the indigenous guy Jesus taught, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And, most of the Western worldview would be antithetical to what Jesus taught.
Kind of true, isn't it? I mean, if you just even look at the basic teachings. I remember as a boy in Sunday school and hearing the teachings of Jesus and then looking at our culture around. Even as a young kid, I saw, but there's a breach here. We say that we're followers of Jesus and that Jesus, we want to be obedient. I was taught to be obedient to Jesus, accept him as my personal savior. Now you're in. Now here's what's going to happen. You'll eventually be rescued from this place called Earth, and you'll be sort of rescued into a disembodied existence somewhere else. In the meantime, be obedient. And then those obediences were to kind of very, very specific things. Don't lie, don't cheat. When you start dating, don't touch a girlfriend. Those sorts of things. There's all kinds of little sort of moral things. And you grow up with the idea that faithfulness to Christ is a sort of some things you do to sort of maintain a salvation that you're getting, which means you're going to be helicoptered out of this place that's going to go to decay eventually. That was called the gospel.
Right, and which basically that version of the gospel it's about 2,500 years old. It comes out of the teachings of Greek philosopher Plato.
Thank you.
I was Platonic dualism. Yeah, and then as a result, it's been embedded in Western Christianity. And, nowhere in the scriptures does it teach a disembodied person. But because of this teaching and this dualism, which is to create a privileged position of what we call the ethereal world or the spirit or the soul or the mind above the material, which would be our bodies and our the earth and things like
and
that.
And all those relationships,
yeah. So we end up placing more priority on that, and then creates a hierarchy. And so now anything physical is suspect, right? Mm-hmm. Including good works, including just the taking care of the earth because hey, it's going to burn up anyway, which is another wrong teaching, by the way. But and so that is just baked in the bread of Western Christianity. And so what we try to do is teach a more indigenous worldview, which would be more like Jesus.
So how does that relate to your book? Let me pull this out here. Shalom in the Community of Creation, right? Your harmony way. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about this book, and then we'll kind of go back to some of these ideas, because I think this gives a foundation. Tell us about the harmony way that you articulate, or a vision of shalom that parallels an indigenous harmony way.
Yeah. So this kind of started with me on something I did with a group called the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Their multi-ethnic ministries invited me to a 5-week journey back in 2001, I think it was. And they wanted to talk, they wanted to spend 5 weeks together. 1 week in a retreat setting where teaching was going on about shalom and basically the biblical meaning of it and all that kind of stuff. And then 2 weeks on the Cherokee Trail of Tears, because they wanted to look at where shalom had been broken most in the country. And then 2 weeks on what we call the Civil Rights Freedom Trail, which was involved African Americans. And so we spent 5 weeks together, 4 of which were on a bus with 50 people and our families, and it was quite fun. And very meaningful, changed my life. But during teaching time, when we were talking about shalom, I kept thinking, well, in our Keetoowah people have a sort of a similar thing, and we call it Eloheh. And it's this sort of big picture idea, because shalom is so much more than peace. I mean, that's what we think it is, but it's so much more. It's about justice. It's about reparations. It's about making sure that the land is producing what it's supposed to, and things are in abundance. It's that picture that's given from the beginning of Genesis all the way through where they set up the laws in Deuteronomy and other places where it talks about not gleaning the edges of your field, setting aside 1/7 of your land, all of those kinds of things. It's tied in with this whole Sabbath system as well. So that the poor and the wild animals can eat. And so it's this thing that God is concerned about everything in creation, not just human beings. And so this is set up, and then most of the prophets are just calling people back to that, back to this way of living. And then when we finally get into the New Testament, Jesus announces, his announcement in Luke 4 has everything to do with this system of what I call the Shalom Sabbath Jubilee system. And Jesus says, I am Jubilee. I'm the one that fulfills this. And he didn't mean this just in a spiritual sense. He meant it in a physical sense. And so what does he do? The first thing he does is they're challenging him. He talks about like God's relationship with these other people, the widow from Zarephath, and the Naaman, the Syrian, and they get mad at him. They want to kill him, right?
Right.
But this is Jesus' big announcement. It's like, I've come to restore Jubilee, which is a part of that whole system. Jubilee is when sort of everything goes back. Land goes back to the original owners. People's debts are wiped out. Prisoners are set free, etc. And so they understood this not in like the way the West understands it. The West understands it as a spiritual, and that's because of the Greek dualism. But Jesus meant it as holistic, everything. Like starting right now, the kingdom of God is now, and this kingdom is a shalom kingdom, right? And so most of the rest of the New Testament, which are what we call occasional letters, which are mostly Paul's letters and Peter's letters and a few more, are about how do you live this shalom life out? And a great passage that sort of deals with this directly is because it says Jesus is our shalom, Ephesians 2, right?
Okay, I read that in one of your books here, but again, that would be translated in my Bible as Jesus is our peace.
Well, it's the word eirene,
okay,
which is the Greek word, but that's in the translation is actually how they translated the Hebrew word shalom into the word eirene. So, and it's mentioned 44 times in the New Testament and 100-something times in the Old Testament, plus all the forms of shalom, which would be like shalem, which is to repay, or to, all these other kind of derivatives.
Okay, yeah. So Jesus, Jesus. When I say if I'm going to be the New Testament biblical, Jesus is my peace doesn't mean Jesus soothes my burning conscience, lets me sleep at night.
Right. That's an American individualistic, right? Or maybe Canadian. Should I say Canadian individualistic?
Speaking from yeah.
But again, individualism is one of those things. The people who wrote those scriptures weren't writing from that individualistic. They hadn't been through what we call the Enlightenment, right? They weren't so affected by that. They hadn't even been very affected by the Greek world and the Greek thinking. Jesus was a great example of what I call a decolonized mind. There was, Roman all around him, and yet he remained true to his indigeneity, so to speak. So I forgot where I was going with that.
Well, let's just talk a bit more. Okay, I took a bit of notes just in case.
Oh, wait a minute. One more thing.
Yeah.
I was just going to give you an example of how the New Testament sort of, how those books and the New Testament later then help people figure out in their particular problems that are going on with their particular situations. And one of them is in 1 Peter 4, I think it's beginning in verse 8, and it says, like, above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. And don't neglect to be hospitable to one another, which is, hospitality is a big part of shalom. And don't complain when you take somebody in. And each one has received a gift. Use it to build up one another. And so this is shalom, right? But it's not just about us. It's written to the we, right?
Right.
And so, and what happens to me is a byproduct of the we. So, but the interesting thing about shalom, it's like, if half of my community is fed and half are starving, no one has shalom. This is something that has to be shared, and it has to be. And when we talk about bringing harmony to the world, I want to talk, if it's okay, just for a second about this Genesis 2 thing, because everybody talks about this dominion thing, right?
Right.
So Genesis 1 is this beautiful picture of this balance and harmony of the earth and everything, the sun and the moon. And then in Genesis 2, it sort of gives like the marching orders for people. And what is the marching order? So there are these 4 words that are used. I'm not going to go through all the Greek now, but the one is always translated dominion. But dominion, interestingly enough, isn't always translated to rule over. It's also translated in a number of places to take care of or be responsible for, right? And so, and then the context of the whole thing then is like tend the garden, till the soil, take care of this, what I call the whole community of creation. And so that is who we are as people. If we are taking care of the whole community of creation, whether it be like we're taking care of the earth or water or trees, or whether it be we're like taking care of missing and murdered indigenous women and trying to work on that, or getting good water to cities that need it, or whatever is out of balance, whatever is out of harmony, that's our job. That's our purpose as human beings.
Right.
And that's what makes us indigenous also, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, so let me Randy Ray Aldred. I'm assuming, yeah, he's a good friend of yours, right? So I every time I'm out in Vancouver, I see if he's around, and he's just always a nice hang. Go for a coffee with him, and I one time I was with him, and I had just been part of a group of Christians that had sort of come alongside an Indigenous community outside of Winnipeg to be part of a justice fight. I won't go through all of it. If anybody wants to look up Shoal Lake 40 Freedom Road, they can do that. So I came off this and learned a lot about what it means to come along another group of people. And I was talking to Ray, and I said, Ray, how do I become a better ally? Like, what would that look like? Like, what do I need to learn so I can do this better and better? And it's funny what he said back. He said, the best thing you could do for us is to become Indigenous. And then, his finger, he waved his long finger and he says, hear what I didn't say. I didn't say become Indian. I said become Indigenous. And then the conversation moved off, and I didn't ask him to unpack that. How would you unpack that from your understanding for a guy like me? Like, what does that mean?
So one of the books that I had 3 books published last year. So the first one was called Becoming Rooted, 100 Days Reconnecting with Sacred Earth. And it's 100 meditations or devotionals, if you will, and then an action point for each to how to reconnect and how to understand, how to basically adopt a more indigenous worldview, right? Not become Indian, but a more indigenous worldview. Because we're all indigenous from somewhere. I mean, to be indigenous with what I call a capital I means that we are people who have lived on a particular land in a particular place and learn how to live with the earth and each other and take care of it. All of our people come from an indigenous background from somewhere. And even though now we live in this global world and mobilization and everything else, and we're living in different places, we can still become a small I, indigenous to the land that we're on, by doing exactly what it says in Genesis 2, by taking care of the whole community of creation, by getting our hands in the dirt and making sure that it's healthy, by making sure that the systems around us are healthy, with the economic, educational, political, et cetera, et cetera. When they are out of balance, everybody gets hurt.
Everybody's out of balance.
The whole community of creation gets hurt. And so our job is to just simply maintain the balance. And here's another thing about worldview. Like when I was taught at my church, like, well, human beings were created last, because they are the crown of creation.
Right.
But that's not how we think as indigenous people. Human beings were created last because they're the only ones sort of qualified to maintain this harmony and balance with the rest of creation.
How's that different from, like, when you talk about, say, a shalom community or a shalom existence, how's that different from utopianism? Like,
oh yeah.
What's the difference between those two things?
Yeah. So utopianism, which is basically Western Christianity, tends to be a utopian religion. It either is living for like heaven one day, and just look at a lot of the hymns, or it's trying to go back to like, oh, we've got to be like the early church, right? Both of those are utopian vision. They don't take into account all of our realities right now. Right. Indigenous ways of living and this shalom and harmony way are parallel. And I need to talk about what ways that is, but that's about like, what am I doing today that's making a difference? What am I doing today to bring harmony in the earth? What am I doing today to make sure that I'm humble and that I'm in a place to learn and receive from others? It's not about, what the teachings for the future are. No, I'm not in the future. I don't even know what will happen in the future, but I know what today is. It's kind of like that, Jesus said, hey, don't worry about tomorrow. Today's got enough problems, and you take care of today. And so that's very much, I think, an indigenous way of thinking.
So is utopianism and perfectionism, are those sort of two sort of sister illnesses?
Yeah, those are Greek concepts that come right down from Greek philosophy. And the idea of perfectionism, so that's not what when the scriptures talk about perfectionism, it's not talking about flawlessness, which would be the idea of like a something that has no flaws in it whatsoever, right? Right. That's not what be you perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect is. It's like, do the job you were fulfilled, fulfill the job you were made to do. If you're perfect for the job, you're perfect. That means human beings are perfect when they are bringing harmony and balance to the world, when they are creating shalom.
Do you know what? Okay, let me tell you. I'll tell you something, and then tell me if this is what you're talking about. In my early 30s was when I sort of really kind of realized that one of the major reasons I was put on this earth is to sing for people. That simple. And I started doing that. And when I'm on stage and I'm singing for people, there is a sense of wholeness, flowness. There's something so right about it for me, and so other people experience it. They say it as well, but for me, and so it was like COVID killed me because I'm singing to cameras, and I'm glad I could do that. I'm glad we have this technology, fine. But when I got back, but I started to really suffer in my spirit. I don't know who I am. Am I wasting space in the planet? I wasn't even connecting it to, and then as soon as we got on the road again, I'm in front of people, I'm starting to sing the songs. All of a sudden, there it was again. I'm supposed to do this. This is my way of flourishing creation, my primary way of, and it's perfect.
Yeah. And what's happening there, if we want to break it down, what's happening, it's a healing ministry. You are healing people's souls. You are healing them because you're bringing. When you listen to music, it's different than when you listen to a sermon, right? People listen differently. They listen more open. They listen more able to receive. And so when you sing a ballad, for example, the one that got to me so long ago and we talked about is because I have a troubled son who's been in and out of treatment and things for a long time. Is the song Absalom. And you sing that, and I can relate to, having that son that's cut off from you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that ministered to my soul, I guess is a way to say it, because I was open for that.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's perfect. And that's why, it's a way of bringing harmony, because you're healing people.
This lady, I was walking down the street, walking my dog a while back, and this lady stopped me on the street. kind of had a bit of a rough look to her, and she goes, "Steve Bell." And I go, "Oh," and she goes, "Every time I hear you sing, I hate God less."
Oh,
and I thought,
great.
Isn't that great, right? But other people feel the same sort of thing when they kind of get into that thing that they do. Like a mechanic can sort of tell you they can get into a zone, working on a motor, or they just understand. They know things when they're doing that they don't know in other places.
Yeah.
And so and there's a sort of sense of well-being and you are contributing to the we. But
people are starving for connection. Especially after COVID. It just means so much for people to be open and honest. And this is why I love, honest songwriters, right? Who sing from their hearts, and because you can do it in a self-righteous way too, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can, as musicians, we know, it's easy to get your head all in the game and everything else. But if you understand what you're doing is opening people's hearts up.
Yep.
I mean, in connecting, what could be better than that?
Another lady once talked to me after a concert, and she was an atheist. And I knew she was an atheist. She always comes to my concerts, though. And we went for lunch one time, and I said, "Why do you come to my concerts? I know that you don't believe any of this, and I'm pretty Christian. I mean, you can't go through a Steve Bell concert and not know what I'm coming out of." And she said this. She says, "You tell your stories, and you tell them joyfully, and you tell them honestly." And she says, "And I can take those home, and I can think about it, and I can think about my story." She says, "There's joy in that." She says, I don't necessarily have to agree with how you frame it." She says, "As long as you do that," she says, "I'll always come." And then she said, "If you ever tell me my story, you'll never see me again."
Interesting.
Yeah, she says, "You tell your story forever, and I'll show up. You ever tell me my story, and you'll never see me again." And I remember at that point, I'm going back through my experience of the Christianity that I was taught. It really was, and you see this a lot in Christian music, telling people their story,
right?
And you actually have the nerve to do it from the stage.
Yeah, and story's an interesting thing. So I mean, and that's why I love ballads, right? Mm-hmm. I mean. Ballads to me are my favorite. My aspiration is to be a songwriter who sings almost all ballads, right? Huh. So, because you find yourself in other people's stories. Now, Here's the interesting thing about worldviews. The Bible, and get ready, hold on to your seat for this one. The Bible is 90% story.
90?
90% story.
Wow.
So I used to say it was 75% because that's what I had learned along the way in my academic pursuits. And both of my Old Testament professors at the seminary said, no, they've recalculated that, and they're saying it's 90% story now. And so here's the difference. In the West, when you hear story, first thing you think of is, did this happen? Yeah. So if you're a conservative Christian, you're defending that it did happen, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you're a liberal Christian, you're trying to show how it didn't happen that way, and it's a metaphorical reason or whatever. And yet neither one of those are a correct way of interpreting those stories the way that the people who wrote them wanted them interpreted. An indigenous way of interpreting that story is, what's the truth in that story? Right. What's the truth for me in that story? What's the truth for my community in that story? What can I learn from this story? Not, did it happen? Did it happen has relatively little to do with it. And so it's a whole different world when you start talking about story. And in the West, they use story, like a children's sermon or the to accent the, sermon afterwards or things like that. But that's really a Western invention. The way to actually share and get to people's hearts and to share the gospel is to tell story.
Well, doesn't the problem with that, though, from the viewpoint or the worldview I was growing up in, is that if I just tell story, I can't control the outcome, right?
Exactly.
So if I tell a story and then say, now, here's the 3 takeaways, right? I can start to control the outcome a little bit to make sure.
You already have by naming the takeaways. You've told people, I'm going to tell you what's important here rather than allowing them and the Spirit to work with them to tell them what's important.
So is that a profound distrust of Spirit? Is that, because
I think it is.
Because people do interpret things negatively. You can take anything and create a monster with it. If you're a Christian and you have this faith that you want to share, do you just have to trust the story and not worry about, because that's not how we were taught. A friend of mine said that he was talking to a non-Christian friend, and he said Christians, when they invite you over for dinner, metaphorically speaking, he says not only do they not trust you to eat your own food, they'll actually cut it up for you and then chew it for you before they give it to you.
That's it. Exactly. Or let me give a more common one.
And it's profoundly insulting.
Yes,
right?
Let me give a more common one that we see and we notice as Native people. It's a potluck, right? Mm-hmm. Before they're going to tell you where to sit, they're going to explain what all the food is and how to get in a line and all the things that you would do to kindergartners, right?
Right.
But it has to be told and explained. To me, let me cut through all that by saying this. I believe God to be the most vulnerable being who exists. If God is love, then vulnerability is a big part of love. And certainly, if we look at the life of Jesus, from start to finish, all vulnerable. And so that vulnerability then is the most spiritual thing that I can tap into. And so when I am vulnerable as a human, because I'm just a human being, as a human, my vulnerability is the most spiritual that I'll probably ever be. And so the opposite of vulnerability then is things like control, superficiality, just not caring. All of that is the opposite. And so, which direction am I going? If I'm cutting up the food and chewing it for you and give, whatever, that is not vulnerability. That is not allowing people to allow the Spirit to deal with them. It's telling them this is what you have to do. And that's one of the first academic articles I ever wrote in the Nate's Journal was about structure and values in the Native church and in the Western church. And they're almost opposite, like we don't control our meetings the way that the church does. We all sit around looking at each other's faces, believing that everybody has something to share, rather than look at the back of everybody's head and one person up front who's speaking for God. It's just a total reorientation of how things are done.
So if you handed a Christian indigenous community, $3 million and say, build a worship building, and then ask this is all generally speaking, a sort of a white Western congregation to do the same thing, how different would those buildings look?
Well, first of all, you'd have a hard time finding a Christian indigenous group that wasn't what I call a poor imitation of a bad model.
Oh, got it.
So because the missionaries have been so successful in controlling and creating this image of themselves rather than the image of who God is among those tribal people, our churches are what I call often a poor imitation of a bad model.
Okay.
So that's maybe not. But if you said to a traditional community, or let's just say a Christian community or followers of Jesus who are practicing their traditions, they would build probably help people with housing. They would probably build like a sweat lodge or something, depending on their traditions, or a longhouse or something. They would build a place that benefits the whole community, maybe a basketball court for the kids, those kinds of things.
But they wouldn't dump they wouldn't dump a bunch of money into a high-tech auditorium, likely.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, we had when I pastored a church in Nevada, Carson City, Nevada, for 7 years, and we built a outdoor arbor that had a dirt floor and fire in the middle. It was a 8-sided arbor with a big hole in the roof, and it gets cold in Carson City. And the missionaries built us a beautiful church, big rock church with everything, you know. But most of the time, once we built that arbor, everybody wanted to meet out there around the fire, looking at each other. We finally got rid of the pews from inside and got chairs and all that kind of stuff, and put them in a circle. But the thing is, I mean, I would come in as the pastor. You go in early, you get the church warmed up on a really cold day, and then, you know, one of the old native grandmas would come in and she would say, "Pastor, we're going to meet outside today, right?" And so I'm like, now I got to go start the fire outside and get, you know, everything more. Well, so, yeah, different values.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? I remember a few years back, and again, just I'm not a good thinker, but I can't stop thinking, and all of a sudden it occurred to me that the teachings of Jesus, when Jesus spoke, and when people wrote down those teachings, the Western worldview didn't exist.
Exactly.
And that it's almost impossible for me to hear the words that Jesus actually spoke. If I'm coming from this frame of reference, I'm white, cisgendered, middle class. I'm, you know, one of the most privileged people that has ever been born to this planet. Those, you know, Jesus was not writing to me. Or was not speaking to me at those times. And I was taught, when I read the teachings of Jesus, these are all directly to me, and all that. And it's all of a sudden occurring, no, like nobody at that time in history could have imagined our worldview at all. Right. So how then do you, which is why you can go to Sunday school and hear the teachings of Jesus and watch the community live exactly, almost in many ways, opposite to those teachings and see no conflict. You know, right. Militarism, consumerism, individualism, like all those sort of Western things that we defend.
Keeping programs going for so long that no one has time to build relationships and true vulnerable friendships.
Yeah.
That's one of the high crimes of the church.
Yeah, you know, and then it suddenly dawned on me, just from my association with like you and Terry LeBlanc and Cheryl Bear, and had some wonderful conversations with Richard Twist back in the day, and realizing that there was an indigenous way of looking at things that was probably closer to the Hebrew way of looking at things than I would ever be able to really fully appreciate, and that if I was ever going to have those eyes, those set of glasses, I might have to do it through indigenous worldview. Like it might be a pair of glasses I have to put on. And you wrote a whole book, again, Shalom in the Community of Creation, where you talk about the harmony way as sort of a construct. It's a pair of glasses you put on and you kind of go, oh, it's a way of seeing. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah. So as I started to say at that one point, and I guess I lost track, is that I then discovered, wanted to know more about my own a tribal way of Eloheh. I knew that Navajos had something similar called Hojo. And so what I did during my doctoral research for my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, was to basically interview elders, spiritual leaders, and query a total of what ended up being 45 tribes all over the United States, Canada, and Hawaii, basically, about this this way we call the harmony way, or every tribe has their own way of expressing it, but they're all similar to shalom. Then I come to find out later that it actually, the Maasai have something similar, the Zulu, the Ikalahan Filipino, the Sami, the indigenous peoples all over the world. So these are like our original instructions, if you will. And that is, these values that come out of that, like generosity and hospitality and including people instead of excluding them, and having a very tangible spirituality, and that's good for today, right? That's being lived today, and all these kinds of things that are so similar. And so what I found is 10 Harmony Way values that I list in the back of that book that were basically consistent with the biblical shalom, and so that's kind of how I came up with all of that. And then for us as indigenous people, living those values is very much then in line. And I'm not saying anyone's perfect in that flawless way, or there's no utopianism or anything like that, but are very much in line with the teachings of Jesus.
Could you outline some of those? I think you got 10.
Yeah, and they're in the back of the book there. I don't have the book with me.
Oh,
but,
okay.
Towards the end of the book. But I think and each has sort of like sub points under it.
Yep.
Have you found them?
I had it marked. It's okay.
Yeah,
it's
so,
okay. People can read it. Yeah.
Yeah. So tangible spirituality,
Yeah.
Respect, including others, hospitality, generosity, consensus instead of force,
Yep.
All those kinds of things, that cooperativeness, communality.
And they really do offer a fairly sobering critique of Western colonialism, Western worldview, if you sort of apply those to how we look at things.
Yeah, and that's what we do here at Eloheh. We actually bring people in. We have extended weekend schools like Thursday evening through Sunday afternoon. We teach these things. We share our stories with one another. We have ceremony together. Sometimes we watch funny movies together, or an Indian movie or something, to kind of talk about the differences, and it's just a great experiential weekend where people get sort of, and we make no bones about it. Our goal is to convert everyone from a Western worldview to a more indigenous worldview, because that's what's going to sustain us.
Well, I got to admit, if I do lie awake a lot at night, and I'm quite stressed about what I think is coming. I think in terms of environmental collapse and social collapse, political collapse. And I don't think that the church as we know it right now has much to offer. I hate to say it. And
the church is like, we need a do-over. Right.
Yeah.
And I think we're on the precipice right now of the most major change, one of the most major changes in the church that ever came. And I think learning from indigenous people is one of the keys to what's going on. And so we are watching communities come up that no one recognizes as the church. Right. And yet they are communities that are heartfelt, loving each other. People are free to talk about Jesus. They're free to talk about their spirituality, all this thing. But it's not the forced, controlled environment that the West has created. And and they're meeting in bars, they're meeting under bridges, they're meeting in sweat lodges, and it's wonderful. And so that's just starting to happen. We're just, I mean, not, depending on how fast these movements go, I may not be alive one day to see where they end up. Right. But I'm very hopeful, especially with the millennials and the Gen Zs who absolutely rejected the paradigm that they were handed, and want truth and want community and all these kinds of things. So.
Okay. You know what? Okay, so we're almost kind of getting up to an hour. I sort of don't want this to go too much further. There's about 1,000 things I wanted to talk about. We didn't talk about doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, that we didn't talk about a phrase that I just wanted you to chat about, Euro-patricine. My last interview was with Norman Wurzburn. We talked about the Anthropocene, like the age of human dominance over nature. And I saw, and I'll put a link of this lecture I just watched yesterday that you gave, where you use this word Euro-patricine. You don't have to comment on that right now. I'm just going to throw some things at you and ask you to pick one or two. I also wanted to ask you about the word decolonization, and what does that mean, and how does that happen?
Yeah.
So do you want to pick any of those and make a few comments?
Let's just go to decolonization, since everybody's talking about that nowadays. Yeah. So basically, it's to begin to like the layers of an onion, to peel away at the lies that empire has told us. Okay. Like the lies that bear a facade of greed. The lies that tell us that we have to stick with just our people, the lies that tell us, like history, especially, like this is what really happened, but we don't hear from the other side of what happened, right? So I always say there's no such thing as history, only histories, and we need to hear all the histories. As we begin to peel away at those lies of empire, all of a sudden the whole thing starts to unravel, and we realize that we've been living out of a false reality, a false history, a mythological existence, and then we begin to ask ourselves, well, then what's real? And for us, what is real is finding your own indigeneity. As you're decolonizing, is coming back to your own who you were created to be. You were created to care for the garden in whatever way that is, and are you caring for the garden? And then out of that, the byproduct of the prime product, which is caring for the garden, or taking care, bringing harmony back to the earth or to the world, you find your happiness, right? In community, and people who can be vulnerable together and love one another.
Okay, given your understanding of the harmony way, and to go back to Adrian saying we are your medicine. I have a question for you personally. One old Baptist to another. Why do you bother with Jesus at all?
Well, at age 10, I had a very real experience with Jesus, and then again at age 19, I was lost. I was wandering. I was on drugs. I couldn't get myself off of drugs, and I decided that, like, I'm going to try Jesus. And so my prayer was, if you will get me off these drugs, I'll follow you the rest of my life, and I'll never look back. And it happened. I mean, instantly. It doesn't happen instantly for, I think, a lot of people, most people, but it happened instantly with me. And I realized that I was free from that bondage. Now, if I wanted to be free, I needed to, begin to follow the one who freed me. And so as I walked that walk and began to, realize, like, there's a certain way to do these things, I was given some good instructions and some bad instructions, but eventually I figured it out, and that God wanted me to be me, and everybody's unique in that kind of a situation. And then as I read all the stories and the things that Jesus taught, I'm like, well, this is pretty consistent with what happened to me, so I must be following the right one. So.
It's funny because I've got so many friends that are either leaving faith or have left faith. And I find when I hear their reasons, I have no counter argument. Like, I just get it. I totally get it. And at points for me, I wonder, why am I staying either? And I think for me, it's kind of the same. It's experience. I've had moments of encounter that I can't deny, no matter what I don't understand, no matter what doesn't make sense. There have been moments of light, of love, of peace, and all those things. And I can't say they didn't happen. They did, Yeah, and they have sustained me, and I can't go back on it.
Right. So with me, it's not like just like this one time. It's like, like you said, it's reaffirmed over and over and over again. And when I'm praying and God sends 4 eagles to give me a sign, or, different things like that, it's like, okay, well, like, maybe there's a chance that I'll find out, one day, like, this was, somebody else, but, it's pretty consistent, and I'm pretty convinced that it was actually Jesus. So I'm going to stick with that regardless of the consequences.
Okay, let me tell you a quick story, and then I want to do a bit of a book reading list, and then we'll share a song and we'll let you go. But I was telling Norman Words about this story. During COVID, I found myself going out for long walks every day, and I'm a creature of habit. I go the same exact route every time. I don't like making decisions. I pick my route, I go. There's a place by the river, and I'd go sit there, and I lost my dad recently. There's some other sort of personal things that were very difficult. COVID, of course, tore our lives apart. The whole Trump stuff that was going on that just was so disturbing for me. And I'd go and I'd sit by this river and I'd cry and I'd sing and I'd pray and I'd think and all those things. And there became a moment of just, because I went to that same space day after day after day, there's about a 3-foot area that I'd go and sit by the river. There's an old decommissioned train bridge and it looks very nice. That I became to crave the place. I started to crave being there, and I couldn't almost have a good day unless I at least spent 5 minutes on that little plot of land. And this is new for me. I'm an urban guy. I'm not a, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not a nature boy. Like, there's mosquitoes out there, you know? And so, but there was just something about this place. And then there's one day, as I was sitting there, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and I looked over, and there was a little coyote cub coming down this path, and I had never seen a coyote. But the animals were starting to return to the cities. Do you remember early COVID? And this little coyote cub came down, and it was just trotting along the path, and it suddenly came about 3 feet from me, very, very close, and it noticed me, and it stopped, and it looked up at me, and it wasn't startled, and we just kind of looked at each other for 10 seconds or so. And then it just sort of decided it was going to go back, and it sort of very quietly turned around and ambled back down. Now, this is going to sound overly romantic, maybe. It felt like a visitation. I don't know how else to interpret it. It was not a chance encounter. I have no idea how to interpret that event, but there was something in me that felt what Julian of Norwich would say, all is well, all manner of thing will be well. Like, there was just a goodness that was overwhelming, that overwhelmed the tears I had been crying. It didn't fix any of the things I'm worried about.
Right. But you know, the reason that you even suspect that wasn't Creator speaking to you is because of a Western worldview.
Right.
I mean, one of the fallacies of the church is that the church has believed that God is more active within the church than outside the church.
Right.
But God is active, and creation is the first quote unquote book, way before there was a Bible. God has been speaking through creation, and of course the scripture affirms that over and over again. But yeah, and so many in that, to mention that book again, Becoming Rooted, I share a number of my experiences like that, the same like you're talking about, where Creator has just showed up at the right time, and I've felt that overwhelming sense of peace. Like, you know, this is, and so, yeah, don't doubt that. That's that Western dualism saying, you know, don't trust these, you know, the things outside the church and the things that are physical and the animals. Like, how could God, you know, speak through animals? Well, you know, they're all our relatives. So, so that's wonderful. I'm glad you shared that experience with me. You know, that's your sacred place, you know?
It kind of is. Yeah. You know who knew this? Who was not indigenous in the sense that we're talking about? Francis, of course, like Francis, brother, son, sister, moon. You know, that like there is within our tradition the very things that you're saying.
Yeah, but we think that Francis may have somehow come over to America and then gone. But no, I'm just kidding.
Why not? Okay, you know what? Okay, we should probably let this go. I'm probably going to bug you to come back on again sometime. I do want to talk about your Becoming Rooted. I do have it. I've just had enough time to read it very quickly. I would love people to read Shalom in the Community of Creation. This book I've read, I think, 3 times. It really did affect me. Indigenous theology and the Western worldview was a decolonized approach to Christian doctrine. This was I just got this fairly recently, and so I've only read it once. But there's a bunch of stuff. It's all marked up.
You know how to make me feel good.
I just finished reading Mission and the Cultural Other. This would be a reason to have you back just to talk about this book.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, I mean, Shalom's sort of like I wrote another book before that called Living in Color about diversity, embracing God's passion for diversity. But Shalom became sort of my hallmark book, and I think I'm concerned about the last 2 might take over because I'm just getting a lot of feedback on them. And then the Becoming Rooted book is actually taking off as a mass market book. People are finding it everywhere. So
Oh, they
and
are,
it's
right? Yeah.
daily devotional. You know, it's
Yep.
it's not something you really should just read through. You should read day at a time. And
Right.
so
Yeah,
anyway, yeah, thanks a lot for reading the books. I mean,
Well,
I write them because I want people to have a discussion and talk about it. So,
and you're a good writer. I mean, they're not hard to read. They're, you know, you I know you are a scholar, but you don't leave me behind, and so I really appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to close. I'm going to put up a song of mine, "Wouldn't You Love to Know," as a way of closing. It comes from a sermon written by N.T. Wright. We was doing a little talk about how we come to know things, and he says we'll never really know what we don't first love. That love precedes knowledge. And so if that's true, that you need to love in order to know, then he asks the question, wouldn't you love to know? Yeah. It's kind of a pithy little thing. So I think when I look at what we're dealing with in our society right now, and you know, globally and locally, it's not really a lack of knowledge. Really, in the end, it's a lack of love, I think.
Yeah.
And I think if we can flourish that love, you know, and we can develop a deeper curiosity for the other, healing might come that has some sustainability.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, man.
I'll catch you on the turnaround somewhere.
Okay. Take care. Nice to see you.
1, 2, 3.
If you have to love the truth just to know if it is true, wouldn't you love to know? If the essence of a thing begs to hear your tender wooing, wouldn't you love to know? If you can't know a part without delighting in the whole, wouldn't you love to know? If you'd never know a kiss without first cherishing the soul, wouldn't you love to know? To know as you are known, simply love as you are loved. Gently turn this fertile loam to unearth the fragrance of the lover's drug. From the far cloud-hidden star to the solitary bug, wouldn't you love to know? Frankenstein and Faust are yet the rage, unspeakable the severing damage done. Yet on the wind the distant sound of drum, and the sweetness of the sage still might come a kinder age. See the wonder-stricken child, hear the elders' wise in song. Wouldn't you love to know? Wouldn't you love to